Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome. I'm so pleased to see so many people here, although I will say I wish there were more younger people here because, yay, one or two back there, good. We all may have helped pause this, but we need the
younger than somebody.
hopefully, yes, we're all younger than somebody, but you all know what I'm meaning. In any case, I'm Linda Hayward. I'm chairman of the board here at the Southwest Harbor Public Library, and I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight. Before I talk about tonight's program, I just want to highlight that on Tuesday, October 17th, we got a completely different kind of program. We welcome back Bob Thayer, and he's going to talk about going to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which should be fascinating. Anyway, we're going to be fascinated tonight by Raney Bench. Raney, as I'm sure most of you know, is the executive director of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. She is also on the board of A Climate to Thrive, which certainly gets in tonight, and the New England Museum Association. And I'm not going to say anything more because we want to hear from Raney. Raney.
Thank you. Great, thank you, Linda, and thank you all for being here, and to the Southwest Harbor Public Library for hosting this evening. I'm really excited to be able to talk about our topic this evening, which is Wicked Pissah. And if you don't know, this is a regional saying for extreme weather or a really bad storm. So I didn't just come up with it on my own. It is it's local to the region. So next, thank you. And so digging in, I am with Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and we really are passionate about using our historical resources to make history relevant to the things that are going on around us today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we're using historic records in that way, specifically related to storms, survival, and sea level rise. So MDI and Maine overall are very well known for extreme weather, from hurricanes to blizzards. Our location here in the Gulf of Maine makes weather a really important factor in our day-to-day lives. And so part of this is influenced by two major offshore currents that really affect MDI's weather: the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current. The Gulf Stream brings up warmer water from the south. This is generally very salty water as the warm currents are coming north. It is denser than the water in the Labrador Current, which is colder and fresher as it's melting from the Arctic regions. And so that Gulf Stream will sink below the colder water and sort of create these two layers. But depending on temperature and salination between the two currents, there's a lot of adjustment that can take place in their relationship with one another. And as they adjust, the weather patterns change as a result. So there was a new study that was just released this month that the Gulf Stream flow as it comes north has weakened 4% over the last 40 years. So this is going to have some pretty dramatic impacts on our region. Again, as those currents, the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current, start to interplay, the changes interplay with them. So the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current have really strong effects on our fog. So that's part of what is producing our fog here on MDI, which we've been losing fog steadily over the centuries. And it also has a cooling effect on the Northeast. So these currents are interacting with one another, but then on top of that, we have the jet stream coming inland toward the coast. And so that, as it impacts with the weather produced by the currents, can get really complicated really fast. And so one last feature is the Gulf of Maine acts like a bathtub because of the geography of the bottom of the seafloor. Warm water from the Gulf Stream, which is lower, can get sucked into the Gulf of Maine. And then from there, it can be very hard for it to come out, which creates marine heat waves, which we've been seeing more and more of in this area. And then it's also part of the reason why the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest bodies of saltwater warming on the planet. So you're probably wondering, why is there a historian standing up here talking to you about currents and the Gulf Stream? And it's because I'll just do that. That's fine. The weather patterns that are characteristic for this region and for the island specifically have had really profound effects on our settlement patterns. So starting with Wabanaki people, who we know were starting to settle in this region 13,000 years prior to Europeans coming, that their settlement patterns on MDI were really relative to weather patterns. And so it's oftentimes easy to think about Wabanaki people coming here in the summer and leaving in the winter, because historically that was certainly the pattern. But we know that pre-contact, Wabanaki people came here throughout the year. And it makes a lot of sense. If you think about the inland portions of Maine, it can be much more extreme cold, much higher levels of snow and ice on the waters. And so if you're trying to hunt and fish and procure resources, it can be incredibly stressful and difficult. And so you always knew coming to the coast, you had more mild winters and access all the time to the sea to be able to get those resources that you needed. And the reason that we can tell from these settlement patterns where and when Wabanaki people were living on MDI are a variety of things that you can find in the archaeological record. One is clamshell hinges. So that little hinge that holds the clamshells together, it grows rings like a tree twice a year. So once in the summer and once in the winter. And so archaeologists can collect those from sites and determine when that clam was harvested. Seasonal availability of fish and birds as they move and migrate and around the different regions. If those bones are in an archaeological site, we know they were harvested, and therefore people had to be here to do that. So there's lots of ways that we can tell about how, Wabanaki people thrived in this landscape and really understood it to be able to move about and take advantage of those resources to the best of their ability. And the coast and its milder weather patterns played a really significant role in their success. After white settlement starts to come into this region, we see that weather also plays a role in their settlement patterns. So those first European and then later American settlements that start coming onto MDI, the types of crops that can be grown here, the types of livestock that will thrive here are very heavily weather dependent. Clothing, all sorts of things that you might think about as being sort of standard for us today would have had some interplay with weather. And access to the sea was key for all of this. We're an island, and so access to the island from the water required you to have harbors that were relatively free of ice and relatively safe from extreme weather, that allowed you access both to the mainland, but also to outer islands for collecting bird eggs and porpoise and other species, and then also traveling up and down the coastline. So this access had to be safe, it had to be reliable, and it had to be something you could depend on throughout the year to be able to survive in this environment. So these two really important things that you need to survive here, right? That access to coastal resources and inland fisheries and having reliable and safe harbors are really also still impacted by extreme weather. Even though they're relatively consistent and reliable, they still can get shut down based on weather. And so in the historical record, we have documentation for how our predecessors thrived or struggled or made different decisions and survived in these different extreme weather situations. So I think this letter is a really fascinating example in our collection at the Historical Society from 1868 by Jacob Blunt. I'm sure you can all read it, so I won't need to. But in a little excerpt of that, he says, "If you want to send me a little bread if possible, or I don't know what to do. It is the hardest of times that I've ever seen. The ice bars us from the flats." This is a letter he's writing to the town of Mount Desert to ask for food assistance. And so it is dated March 30th, 1868. It's very hard to imagine the clam flats now being so socked in and solid with ice at the end of March, even the beginning of March at this point. But we have a very specific date, we have a very specific cause, and we have a very specific effect. And so weather is a really clear example in this letter from our collection about how the Lunt family was struggling and dealing with overcoming this. Sea ice was known to form in our harbors, both in cakes, but also occasionally locking in boats from being able to get out and other boats with goods to come in. And so we have lots of local stories of people being able to walk from Southwest Harbor and out to the Cranberry Isles or Islesford. So I've got a couple of quotes about some of those from the 1920s. This one is from February 1923 that says, the wind and tide usually create enough wave action to prevent our harbors from freezing over. But in February 1923, the conditions were right for the water to freeze from Cranberry to Islesford to the mainland. And on February 17th of that year, quote, no open water in sight except at the mouth off Great Cranberry Island Pool and by the south shore of Sutton's. Men walked from Islesford 2.5 miles to Southwest Harbor to get supplies. Buster Bunker and Marge and Les Phippen walked to Islesford from Great Cranberry. And a couple days later, on February 20th, Milton, known as Tom Phippen, rode his motorcycle on the ice. The water has not frozen to that degree since. So we have these really specific historic records of extreme weather. And then we have records that are more vague, where we don't have those really good, clear details of what happened. We have hints and suggestions that we have to make different kind of inferences or conclusions from. So we've got this letter, again, I'm sure you can read it, in 1851. And this is indicating that a storm had come through in April of 1851 and washed out a portion of the bridge connecting the island to the mainland. And this is in the collection of the MDI Historical Society. The bridge was built initially in the 1830s by business leaders from Ellsworth, including John Black, and island leaders. And so this was in an effort to provide consistent and safe and reliable transport between the island and the mainland. Before it was transferred to the state, it was managed by this private corporation that ran it as a toll bridge. And in Woodlawn, ooh, I need to have access to the screen. At the Black Museum, or sorry, the Woodlawn Museum, the Black House, John Black, oops, no, too far. Yeah. John Black was the designer for the bridge. So in 1836, the blueprints are here that you can go see at Woodlawn for the toll bridge. So the Trenton side and the Eden side are here. The span, I can't remember what the full span of the bridge was measured to be, but we have the height, and it was a drawbridge. And so we have the design for the details of the draw, which is fascinating. What's even more fascinating, if you're studying climate change and sea level, is that he estimates the maximum height of high water at 14 feet. So we will talk about why that matters and what our maximum height of high water is now in a little bit. But in April of 1851, this is exceeded and some sort of damage is done to the bridge, and we don't know what. It just says by wind and sea. So I don't know if that's erosion from the mainland, if something hit one of the pillars, or if the road portions were washed out. It's sort of a mystery what sort of structural damage was done to the bridge itself. But we do have the record that it required repair as a result. So we have super detailed records, we have vague records, and then we have unbelievable records. And this one, my son claims, is no way that this happened. But in doing my research for these incredible storms, the Purple Fire Snowstorm of 1853 is ranked one of the top 10 weirdest weather events in the country by the Weather Channel. So it's got to be legit, right? And so in 1853, the island did not have its own newspapers yet. And so the accounts that are published that I'm going to read for are from the New York Times, the Ellsworth American, the Whig and Fountain, I think it is, and the New York Daily Herald. So it was picked up regionally and told multiple times by these bunches of different papers. And there are slightly varied stories. So clearly people are interviewing witnesses to the Purple Fire Snowstorm. And so we have slight variations, but then there's also like a consistency across all reporting, which is like the sort of tendency to just take something and repeat it. So we'll just take it with a grain of salt, but it's fascinating nonetheless. And it's described as 20 minutes of terror raining down on Bar Harbor. And so this took place on March 13th. And it was started with like a regular snowstorm. During the day, it was sort of an average snowstorm throughout most of the day. But toward the evening, everything became very quiet before, quote, the awful and sublime storm struck. This is a quote from one of the papers. The lightning was purple and sometimes appeared like balls of fire. It came in through windows and doors and down chimneys, while houses trembled and shook to their foundations. Balls of lightning began streaking down from the sky, rolling along the ground and leaving havoc in their wake. I don't believe there was ever a worse lot of frightened people in the world than the inhabitants of Bar Harbor were that night. The lightning then struck the earth to the depth of several feet and about 10 feet in diameter, and divided into 4 different directions. In one direction, it made a chasm several feet deep that was 370 feet long, lifting, overturning, and throwing out chunks of frozen earth, some of which were 10 or 11 feet long by 4 feet wide, and hurling at a distance rocks, stones, and roots. A correspondent from Gardner wrote in a newspaper called the Fountain and Journal, but this was also reported in the Ellsworth Herald, New York Times, and the New York Daily Herald. Quote again, the purple fire snowstorm created a bizarre effect among a cluster of trees, fortunately away from any buildings. The electric fluid took them out by their roots and threw them in every direction. Some hung by their roots from the tops of the adjacent trees, their roots up and their tops down. According to a March 14th, 1853 report in the Ellsworth Herald, quote, sometimes it appeared like balls of fire, coming through windows and doors and down the chimneys. A great many persons were slightly injured. Some were struck in the foot, some in the eye, while others were electrified and some powerfully and some slightly. So apparently no severe injuries or death as a result of this ball fire lightning event. Masts were torn off ships in Southwest Harbor and in Northeast Harbor. One lightning bolt hit a flagpole and turned it to rubble. So very fascinating account of ball lightning, pretty extreme here on the island. And we don't have any other records other than those few sort of newspaper reports. So we have to sort of determine for ourselves if the historic record is giving us accurate information for that or not. So moving from those 3 examples of sort of how we tell from the historic record what these storms were like and how people lived through them and survived them and thought about them, we're now going to get into a few examples of specific types of weather that we get here in Maine and talk a little bit about some specific storms. So blizzards are the first thing we're going to start with, like seems something we're all used to dealing with. They're rather common around here. They're so common that as a researcher, it's really hard to find newspaper accounts of blizzards, which totally took me by surprise. So when I was doing the research for this story, I would look at blizzards that had struck New England as a whole, that were notorious at various points in history. And then I would go back into our local papers and look for, on the dates surrounding those blizzards, any kinds of stories or accounts or newspaper writings. Virtually never. There's like hardly ever anything written about blizzards in our papers. Every once in a while you'll get, if it was had something to do with power outages or transportation stoppages, or you might get, if there was like really extreme amounts of snowfall, you might get a little story that says that. But if you just do the search on the term blizzard, hardly anything comes up. And you really have to look specifically for the blizzards that you're looking for. So why is that? One reason could be that we're all used to blizzards and they don't really make news. The other is that our newspapers at the time could not predict weather. And so they're not talking about blizzards in advance. And then after the fact, they're only a weekly or a twice weekly paper. And so, excuse me, so it may be that the thing has already happened and it's done. And so there's not much to talk about. I'm not sure, sort of which trend, or there may be other options. But those are 2 possibilities for why we don't find much about blizzards. But we do have a few examples of some interesting blizzard stories for here on MDI. One such occurrence was the blizzard of 1888, called the Great White Hurricane. And this was actually not a traditional blizzard in the sense that we use the term here usually. This was actually the remnants of a hurricane and a tropical storm that came up on the Gulf Stream, was relatively warm, and it hit a cold air jet stream coming in from inland, and it froze all of that tropical moisture and made it into like this hurricane of snow. And so it was a little bit different, but it did cause a lot of destruction in the state of Maine, and all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay, where it did strike as a blizzard. And much of Maine received over 20 inches of snow, and communication and travel came to a standstill as a result. But our blizzards are more likely nor'easters rather than white hurricanes. And so these are storms that usually take place between October and April, when cold winds blow in from the northeast and they hit those warm, moist waters of the jet stream, and then they produce copious amounts of rain or snow, oftentimes with tropical force winds or hurricane force winds that can gale with them. So as I mentioned, it's hard to find newspaper accounts sometimes for these severe weather storms, but we have really great archives online through Digital Archive, which is a consortium of 16 organizations on the island, including the Southwest Harbor Public Library and MDI Historical Society, that are sharing their digital resources freely and openly to the public through the History Trust website and Digital Archive. And so I was able to actually look for images and records that way. And so there's these great images here from Northeast Harbor in 1937, where clearly the roads are blocked in by massive amounts of snow and looks like everyone's having a grand time in their blizzard. And in 1952, MDI got 29 inches of snow, but nothing more about that blizzard was reported, just that they had this incredible amount of snow that came from that one blizzard, which did shut down traffic on the island. And then we do get one headline, which is 36 inches of snow. And this is in 1963. And this was a real doozy of a snowstorm that not only dropped an incredible amount of snow, the temperature change that came with it was 40 degrees difference. So the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 12 hours to a bottom of minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And that made the news. It also had 73-mile-an-hour winds clocked over at Seawall, and all of the roads on the island were closed for a time. One weather event that always makes the papers is hurricanes. So hurricanes are much less frequent in Maine. A couple weeks ago, not included, actually was included, we didn't get it. So in an average year, Maine gets 0 hurricanes. But every once in a while, we do get a hurricane that comes through, and the frequency is about every 30 years or so. So we had a really close call in 1991 with Hurricane Bob, but it was downgraded to a tropical storm, but it still managed to kill 3 people in Maine. Gloria hit southern Maine in 1985, Donna in 1960, and then there were twin hurricanes in 1954, Edna and Carol, that came 11 days apart. And I noticed when Hurricane Lee was sort of coming up and threatening us, a lot of people were chattering about Edna and Carol. And there was a lot of local memory about these earlier hurricanes. So they stay really prominently in our minds here on the island. And so we've got these really amazing stories from hurricane activities, including one from Swan's Island from Ted Turner, who remembers the deadly stories. He didn't see it, but he remembers stories of the hurricane of 1938, ultimately known as the Great New England Hurricane or the Long Island Express, where he says, I heard stories that it knocked down a lot of our old hotel. At the wharf, the wind picked up a building and destroyed it. This hurricane killed 682 people from Maine to Long Island, and it was only the third to hit New England since 1635. The property damage in 1938 was estimated at 300 million, which would be 4.7 billion in today's dollars. So the local memories of hurricanes Carol and Edna in 1954 are much stronger, and those damaged also totaled millions of dollars and destroyed much of that year's harvest. This picture is Hurricane Daisy at Seawall in 1963. And the newspapers are awesome when they talk about hurricanes. They're so fun because they use these really, really incredible language, where for this one related to Edna in 1954, it says, MDI was directly in the path of a vicious, hair-pulling, limb-clutching gal known as Edna. 105-mile-an-hour winds uprooted thousands of trees, apparently, destroyed fishing and pleasure boats, downed utility lines, and, quote, scared the living daylights out of everyone. We only got 3.5 inches of rain out of this storm, but it had really ferocious winds, which blew out windows and shops and houses here on the quiet side. And the seas destroyed several weirs that were just off coast here in the area. These are pictures from the Southwest Harbor Public Library's digital archive collection. This is of Edna sinking a boat here in Southwest Harbor. Edna's maximum wind velocity was 74 miles an hour. Inland, the rain reached almost 8 inches, but here on the island, it wasn't that much. But we definitely had a lot of damage related to other aspects of the hurricane. And then in 1960, Hurricane Donna struck in September, and a lightning bolt hit the Dirigo Hotel and burned it down to the ground. It was built in 1881, and it burned in less than 2 hours.
Where was that hotel?
Dirigo Hotel was up off of High Road and Dirigo in Southwest Harbor here, just up the road here. All right, and we're gonna spend a lot of time in Hurricane Daisy today because this storm is awesome. Hurricane Daisy, sorry, storms. Hurricane Daisy was really impactful here on MDI, but we're actually going to spend a decent amount of time on the impact of the hurricane out on Mount Desert Rock. But before, I'm going to set again some really fantastic language from the newspaper, which says, Hurricane Daisy swirled her skirts at Mount Desert Island as she danced across the North Atlantic to raise a spectacular surf and strong wind, but she dropped less rain here than had been anticipated. The storm will probably go down in legend as the day water ran uphill in Acadia National Park. The heaviest losses here on MDI were suffered from lobstermen in gear, and wharves and docks and all sort of shoreline construction was most damaged by battering waves. If you think about Bar Harbor, which is generally pretty protected from high seas, they had reports of 6 to 10 foot waves in Bar Harbor crashing up along the shore, with the spray reaching 40 to 50 feet high. And then a record was broken at Otter Cliffs, where the spray rose 100 feet above the 180-foot cliffs. And that's according to Park Superintendent Harold Hobler at the time. And he also says that waterfalls coming down Champlain Mountain turned around and ran back uphill. The lobster gear loss at that storm was estimated at 50%. So the seas, this is obviously not a historic image. The seas described by the Coast Guard related to Daisy, the Coast Guard commander S.C. Soares described them as mountainous, which he goes on to clarify is a technical marine term that means mighty high. In case you didn't know. Private wharves, docks, and fish houses were all torn from the shoreline by strong seas in all harbors on the island and in all parts of the island equally. Many trees blew down in northeast and southwest harbors, and there was property damage due again to trees and loss of tree loss in the park and power outages. But if you go a little bit further out to sea, Mount Desert Rock really hit the brunt of it. And so Mount Desert Rock is 27 miles as located sort of going out from Southwest Harbor. And Daisy was not anticipated to be a major storm. It was actually a downgraded tropical storm, and it hit Bermuda as a mild hurricane. And then it was downgraded and expected to push way offshore. But then it got into our area and combined with a nor'easter, and that produced flooding and strong winds, and it changed the trajectory of that storm. So here we see that interplay between these currents that we talked about at the beginning. So in the collections of the MDI Historical Society, we have a transcript of an oral history taken by the lighthouse keepers who were on Mount Desert Rock in Hurricane Daisy. And I'm going to quote really extensively from them because their story is incredible. So, and forgive me, I'm not a Mainer, so I'm going to butcher the way they say words. I apologize. On October 7th, 1963, I was out there, and it was reported a hurricane was coming up from the south, Hurricane Daisy, and it was reported that it was supposed to go out to sea. One guy was off, so there were 3 of us out there at the time. First thing we knew, we started to get fairly heavy seas coming in, so we decided that we would move out with the fire pumps off the end of the generator house, right next to the main dwelling. We went down to the boathouse here, And all of a sudden we heard a grumbling noise and water went right over the top of the boathouse. That wave was the first of many to wash over the whole island during Daisy. The keeper goes on to say, we were standing inside the boathouse, just inside the door. One wave was going by the door so fast, it wasn't even coming inside the boathouse itself. What really got us is it washed up a rock. I would say it was probably go at about 5 tons, and we were standing right inside where it hit. After that sea, which he means waves, he's calls them the sea, subsided, we run like crazy up toward the house. And before we got there, another sea washed over the island and we was right up to our necks. The pictures are not from 1963. I've been trying to find pictures that show the views of where I'm talking about from the keeper's perspective. So they're a little bit from a few different time periods. So he goes on to say, well, I grabbed the porch railing and my engine man, he was behind me and he was in a pothole and 2 tanks rather, 1,500 gallons tanks washed loose and they were rolling around together and he was right in the middle of them. So I let go of the porch and I gave him a hand. He started making out okay. And I turned around and grabbed the porch and the porch was gone. So you can see here what he means by, they're in all of these rocks. And then you've got these big tanks in here and you've got these seas coming up and they're trying to get up onto this porch. And then the porch gets totally washed off the building. The windows get knocked out and water was going right through the main floor of the house. We finally worked ourselves around and got inside the main house. Just about all of the porches were, washed away or something like that, and just got inside and another good sized sea come over and it completely washed the engine room right off. Based on his descriptions, I think this is the engine room, but Willie Granston, who's is with the Great Harbor Maritime Museum, disagrees. He thinks it's on this side, but he talks about trying to get up on the porches. So it's debatable, but I think it's here. So it just washed the engine room completely off, he says. It was a cement block engine room, and if you've ever seen a trick where someone sets a glass of water on a handkerchief and snaps the handkerchief, that's the way it did. Washed all 4 walls right out from underneath the roof. It set the roof down, and we lost all power. Well, there were 3 parts. The kitchen part, there was the living room part, and of course the radio beacon room at the end. We was right in the living room when the generator house went, and we managed to make 1 call out. We still in those days had a landline. There was a cable running from Duck Island all the way out to Mount Desert Rock, and we made 1 call out. All I could get was Duck Island, and I called them and I told them, that we was getting the daylights beat out of us, and we were going to the tower, and that was the last words they had of us. They felt sure we had got washed out. But we packed up some food and whatnot and watched the seas pass by and got into the tower and spent all of Sunday and Monday at the top of the tower. Well, the water would wash out onto the island and then it would recede. And every time it would recede, one of us would be watching and we would say, okay, go. And they would run across and then the other guy would get up into the tower and then he would tell the rest of us when it was all cleared up. That tower out there is 76 feet high, I believe, and sets. The ground is about 20 feet. Anyway, I estimate the seas were 80 feet and that were breaking onto the island. I was looking out the storm panes where the light is and the water was right even with that. Breaking. It wasn't actually washing across that high, but the seas would build up before they broke to about 80 feet. And then they'd break and they'd wash big sheets of granite as big as this room right across the whole island, just like it was a raft. It was unbelievable. The seas would build up as they would come against the island, and then they would build to 80 feet, and then they would hit the island and crash down and flow across the island. The undertow, that was really tremendous. We lost 4 tanks, 2 3,000 gallon tanks and 2 1,500 gallon tanks. The one 3,000 gallon tank, one end came right through the kitchen and washed right through the kitchen and then washed out to sea, and it would start acting just like a piston. The undertow would drag it out, the sea would break, it would come in and it would hit the boat slip and timbers would fly and everything would fly. And then we'd be dragged out on an undertow again and forced back in. We were in the tower for 2 days. They tried to get us out with an airplane and they finally did on Monday afternoon. They dropped us some sleeping bags and some food and whatnot. Then that night it just calmed right down and a tug came up from the base here in Southwest Harbor and picked us up. Just calmed right down, just like that. I know, can you even imagine? That's right. Mount Desert Rock continues to face the worst of Atlantic fury. Pictured here is the keeper's house after Hurricane Bill in 2009. So it's really clear, like, I love storms. I love everything about them. But I don't just love being in storms or talking about storms, reading about storms. There's real lessons to be learned from our history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at the Historical Society for that. We live on an island. And so even though our infrastructure is pretty good now for getting on and off the island and for being able to live a relatively insular life from the sea if you needed to or wanted to, we have the infrastructure and technology that includes early warning systems, better weather predictions, and it means overall we're less vulnerable to storms than we used to be, but we are not immune. This graph shows that since 1950, the sea level has risen 8 inches in Bar Harbor. So the rate of sea level rise is very, very hard to measure because it is rising so fast that it's virtually impossible to get a baseline from which to measure from. And it is just sort of gaining on itself over and over and over again. So it's hard to keep up with it. So this initiative that I'm going to share with you tonight, the MDI Historical Society is working with partners at the Scudic Institute, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, the Oceanarium, and artist Jennifer Steen Boer, using these historic records like the ones I've just shared with you to understand the potential of sea level rise and its impact on MDI. This is from the Scudic Institute. Because sea level is rising at an accelerating rate, as I said, it's very difficult to establish baselines from which to measure for the future. But for example, Bar Harbor, as its sort of normal highest tides of the month, are usually now around like 11 or 12 feet. November 2016 shows a record king tide of 13.6 feet. And then storms, of course, have a tendency to push that even higher. The highest high tide at Bar Harbor on record was 16.2 feet in 1978. So what we're looking at when we looked at those historic records of the bridge that John Black designed in 1836, where a maximum height of tide was 14 feet. We are almost monthly during king tide season, almost exceeding that when we get 13-foot tides. So our tides and our infrastructure and our decisions have to start adjusting to that reality. We just had a king tide last Saturday, which was 12.5. So if you had a chance to be out and see any of the coastline at noon on Saturday, and imagine that king tide, if you look at the predictions for 2050, we would be 1.5 feet higher than that on our average high tides. So that is sort of the estimates that we're using that are coming from the state of Maine for what we should be planning for. So 1.5 feet increased tide from now to 2050 and a 3-foot increase between now and 2100. So king tides and sea level rise are already impacting MDI. We are not as vulnerable as Boston or Portland or Newport or places that have used fill and tried to go where sort of water historically was. I love the phrase water has memory. And so water will go back to wherever it's been. But MDI is really in some ways quite secure from some effects of sea level rise because we have very deep water surrounding us and ledges, but we're not totally safe either. So some of the impacts that you can already see as you go around the island are ghost forests. So those marshlands that are that really important safe space to allow for sea level rise and flooding to come in, and it sort of absorbs that. Those are getting really increased pressure. And you can see here and along here, all of these dead spruce are related to sea level rise. The salt water is killing the roots. And so you'll see these ghost forests lining the edges of most of our saltwater marshes. And so the marshes are designed to keep some degree of development within their own systems to accommodate for changes in sea level, but our sea level is rising so fast that the marsh can't keep up with it. And so you also see suffocation taking place within the marshes themselves. Our infrastructure is not also completely immune to sea level rise. We have low-lying places. We all know it's seawall, right? Every time there's a storm, we all rush out to seawall to check it out. And I know I've seen you out there. So we know that we've got places where there's vulnerability. also created by culverts. So this is the marsh at the Oceanarium, and then the Route 3 crosses it, and then you have Jones Marsh on the other side. That road creates a barrier for the water that is supposed to be able to naturally push into that space. And so you'll see the impacts of a storm that we had here in December on the site of the Oceanarium, partly because of sea level rise and partly because of our infrastructure that prevents the water from moving where it needs to move. Think about Thompson Island at an extreme high tide. It's pretty low between here and MDI. So that's another point. Kittredge Brook, where the community school is, that bridge is pretty low. It is now under plans to be redone, and I'm not sure what they've accounted for in terms of sea level rise. But we also have the bridge in Bass Harbor at the marsh where the Ohio Road is. So lots and lots of different spaces on our island that are vulnerable, that we're already starting to see where infiltration is happening, and we need to start making plans for those. And we think about high tides because they're obvious. But the other part of this is that our low tides are also higher. So our low tides are increasing. And so we notice the clam flats are changing, which is other reasons other than just tide, but we have siltation. And then we are losing some of the grasses that rely on their regular tidal zones because the low tide is getting higher and higher. So December. Nope, wait. I missed a slide. That's really weird. Okay. So December we had a king size. Oh, that's why. Never mind. There we go. So we have done a project on king tides. There we go. So we are using these historic resources, and we're engaging students at MDI High School. We received a grant from Villanova University last fall to work with historic records to document sea level rise. And Scudic Institute came in, and we were working with them to teach the students how to map various locations on MDI where we see tidal infiltration. And they were using historic records, maps, and then we actually had the really amazing opportunity to go watch a king tide happen in real time during their class. So we're out here with the students documenting. There's water all the way up here in the Bass Harbor Marsh. This is at the Tremont School. And they're looking at this. And then we're asking them, okay, so now you see what a regular king tide looks like. What if a storm pushes in at a king tide? And they're like, oh, what are the odds? The odds are December. That happened. So December 23rd, 2022, if anyone was here, we got a humdinger of a storm. And this storm level is what the average high tide is predicted to be in 2100. So this is a 3-foot surge. So this is at Hinckley. As the water is washing across the road there. This is half an hour before high tide that I was there. But this really showcased what our future is and where our vulnerable points on the island are for high tide and seawater infiltration. And then what are we going to do about the infrastructure? This is obviously the gallery in Soamesville. And most of you will probably know that just to the other side of this is the little house that used to be the blacksmith shop. That house was purchased by a family in the 1980s that had no history of seawater in the basement, and at the time that they purchased it. By the 1990s, they were getting some degree of king tide surge into the basement. And when he sold the house 2 years ago, at every high tide, there was salt water in the basement, and including extreme high tides where the water came up and around and ice cakes were floating around to the front of the house. So they decided to sell the house, and the new owners have put in a system of pumps that are automatically triggered when seawater enters into the basement. And so when I didn't include the picture, but we're looking at this house right next to that during the storm, and the pumps were like waterfalls, just gushing like crazy, pumping that seawater out of the basement of the house. So these are the kinds of decisions we have to start making together as an island. We can't make these decisions as towns. We have to work collectively together as an island-wide community to be able to decide what we do with infrastructure, how we deal with saltwater infiltration into our freshwater systems, how we deal with historic resources and structures, and our harbors. And we can't make those decisions until we really understand what's happened in the past and what changes are coming. So the last little bit I'm going to talk about is this is a project specifically related to this, which is called Coastlines MDI. And this is the partnership with Scudic and Jen Boer, who did the stenciling work for us in the Oceanarium. So the oceanarium during the December storm had, if you've been there, they have like the barn and then they have the visitor center where you walk in and pay your admission. The barn had a foot of seawater in it and the admissions office had 8 inches in it. So they're a really amazing site to start talking about how we deal with seawater rise. And so we were able to go out there and actually use the stencil to mark the level of sea level during the storm, so that we have a record of what that sea level looks like from that storm. And then we can also start envisioning what that looks like for future sea level rise. So we, am I able to move?
Yeah.
There we go. So this is the level on the sheep shed from 2022. The marsh is back in here. And so going through and being able to stencil that, the oceanarium is making plans for their site where they are moving all of their electricity up above 4 feet. So there's no electrical outlets or no electrical wires at all below 4 feet. And then they're also making their buildings, the material below 4 feet, easily changeable if it floods. So rather than fighting flooding, they're just adapting their buildings to be able to just rehabilitate them every time they flood. And so, so that's sort of their response to that. We also marked the Soamesville Dam. So this is the rack line from the 2022 storm, up on the fish ladder here. So we're trying to create additional marks. And then if you want to see this, you can go out to the oceanarium and we've created a sea level trail where we've taken those estimates and those storm markers and put marks out on the landscape. So you can see what the predicted levels of sea level rise are going to be. And then we're doing that at the Kelly Farm Preserve with Maine Coast Heritage Trust later this month. So you'll also have another opportunity to take a look at that. We also have been taking this work out to public programs and schools and families. And we invite people to leave a mark on the map of places where they are concerned about sea level rise or where they have witnessed things related to sea level rise. And then you can get involved as well. We need more records. We need historic records. We need records from harbor masters, from recreational boaters, from lighthouse keepers, anyone who's sort of keeping these historic tide records so that we can track this historically. But you also are invited to participate now. So if you go out onto the landscape during a high tide event or a storm, be careful of waves. You can actually take pictures, put like some sort of reference in so we can know like the rock or the building so you can recreate the picture. And you can turn it into Schoodic Institute, who are creating this really amazing interactive map where you can click on any one of these sites and then it will pull up the history, the storm example, the photos that are taken and the documentation of what's happening to the site. So we're trying to build an interactive map that would stretch decades to be able to document all of this work together collectively. Questions or comments about anything? Yeah.
Do you know who the person was who was being interviewed about the Mount Desert Rock?
I have to dig deeper. The keepers' names are not in that part of the record. I have to go in and like try to see. It's a weird. It was an oral history, and I don't think we have the oral history anymore. It's just the transcription, and the transcription is like annotated and photocopied, and so it's not perfect. But I will try to find out for you.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Linda, and then behind. Yeah.
Well, that picture that you had, you said this is the gallery in Soamesville with the lobster pots. Where is that?
This
The old Colonel's.
the old bookstore.
Colonel's.
Yeah, it's like the Soamesville Gallery. So this is the granite parking lot.
Well, that's the parking lot.
That's the parking lot of the art gallery. Yeah, yeah. So it is fully submerged. Hold on. Yes. Yeah.
Who at the Schoodic Institute would we send photos and records in the high times to?
Catherine Schmidt, or you can also send them to me and I can give them to Catherine, but she's been our point of contact for this project. Yeah.
So you mentioned this gallery and then there's a house to, if I'm looking at the gallery, to the left.
It's to the right. It's between the library and the gallery. There's this little house and it used to be a blacksmith shop. And then it was owned by a family since the 80s until just like 3 years ago when they sold it. For now it's a rental. Yeah, there was one over here, sorry, then Jeff. Yeah.
Can you explain to us in a little more detail what the Civic Institute does? It just sounds fascinating.
Yeah, Scudic Institute is the research branch of the park. So the Park Service is generally not funded sufficiently to be able to have their own research scientists on staff. So Scudic Institute has its own nonprofit status as a park partner. So they do research on all sorts of different impacts to the park from not just climate change, but visitation. And it's not always impact driven, but it's also can be, field studies, programs. They've got research scientists that will come and stay for the summer months and study bats and intertidal zones and whatever. So they have been working with us for 3 years on a partnership called Landscape of Change, where we are using historic records to document the speed, scale, and scope of climate change by extending the data sets as long as possible. So every year we focus on something different with them. So we started with birds and pollinators, sea level and climate, seawater temperature and climate. And then last year we did a series of intertidal studies related to the use of art to convey scientific complexity. And then this year we have sea level rise. Gotcha.
How can we access that interactive map you showed?
So if you do a search for sea level rise Scudic, some of the blogs that Catherine is posting will come up, and it's an anecdata map. So the anecdata site is done by the BioLab, who's another partner on this project. But Scudic's entering the data, so you should be able to find it that way.
And just so that
Yeah, online questions.
I will have online questions, but also to everyone who signed up, I will send a link to the recording as well as these links that she's mentioning as well, and I'm sending them online to folks right now.
That's why librarians are the most amazing people on planet. Thank you.
King
Online
tide.
question?
What is a king
I'm
tide?
sorry, I should have described what a king tide is. A king tide is an astronomical high tide that happens at 2 different points in the year. So it's not at every full moon or every new moon, but the tides have a certain pull that happens where seasonally they're higher in Europe or other times they're higher here. So the astronomical high tides for king tides are happening now for us. They happen generally for us in the fall. And they'll stretch every month for about 5 months. And so you can actually look for the next king tide will be at the end of this month. If you look on the tide charts online, you can see it'll just show where the astronomical high tides are. And I think the Saturday, the 29th at 11 is 12'2" maybe high tide. Don't quote me exactly on the number, but it's right around in there. Yeah. Other online questions?
Well, Catherine Schmidt's online.
Oh,
So-
awesome. I didn't think she could be here because
Yeah,
Scudic had a thing tonight. So
And going for it.
she's amazing. So she can also put the link in for the map and then that'll be great. Yes, Bill.
I'm curious to know if the toll keeper kept records at Trenton Bridge. Because it's
Good question.
shocking that they would design the middle section that would allow passage of boats, right from the get-go.
Yes.
And the newer bridge that was celebrated in 1920 actually was a swing bridge that pivoted 90 degrees on a big pylon in the middle. Pretty fancy. And you just wonder, given the tide swings up there,
Yeah.
I mean, it's only navigable for, I don't know, maybe 5 hours either side of a high tide or something.
It is fascinating that it was a drawbridge. Most of the bridge, so 14 foot was the maximum estimated highest tide at the time they did the bridge. So they built the roadway at 16 feet. They didn't give themselves a whole lot of leeway. And then the toll, the distance for a boat to go, I mean, not the toll, for the draw is 28 feet. So it was accommodating boats that could fit in that 28 feet, but it's still only at the height of 16 feet.
But the
For the bridge.
implication is there's a lot of boat traffic through there.
Enough that they did a drawbridge and they had a keeper that was there, managing the bridge, not just the toll.
Right.
Yeah, the design is gorgeous. I didn't share pictures of all of it, but the draw is designed here, and it's all intricately, like, all the chains are beautifully drawn, and it shows exactly like how it would function. It's a really gorgeous blueprint. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? I got two, yes.
Jen Miller said that she is walking the circumference of the island. Could you tell a little bit about her plan and to what end she's doing that?
Yeah, you can find her blog. It's Coast Walks. And so Jen Steenboer has been doing the Coast Walks for a number of years. And she is going around and like doing oral histories and interviews with different people who are embedded within those communities or have seen change over time. And it's been on pause for a little while, but I know she wants to get it back up and going. She's been really instrumental in this project with us. She did a series of 6 original artworks last year that are looking at, as I mentioned, sort of how you communicate complex scientific data through art to be able to try to reach a lot of different audiences in different ways. Those are on display at the Oceanarium, or you can access them through our website if you want to see them online. But I don't know when she's resuming the Coast Walks, but you absolutely can find all of her entries for her blog online.
You should also mention the prize winning Chewbacca.
Oh. Later, Bill. Yes.
Jen Boer.
Yes, I will say that at the end.
Oh,
Thank you. Yes, another question?
My question was the storm's purple lightning storm.
Yes, Purple
So-
Fire Snowstorm.
Purple fire snowstorm. So you said that there were no records outside of the newspaper records. Does that mean that nobody in their personal letters or diaries or journals that you guys have access to records the storm at all?
I could clarify, it's not that there's no records, it's that we haven't seen any yet. So absolutely, if we go digging through the archives on any one of these incredible libraries or historical societies on MDI, or families who have long legacies here, we absolutely may find somebody who's written a diary account or a letter about that event, but it has not come to light yet. So that's the thing with our archives, is they are endlessly filled with amazing information that we can relate to our lives today. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned this from Sarah White. You mentioned specific people's adaptations, also the Oceanarium. And this is an island-wide concern. What are your thoughts about the organized towns adapting for rising sea levels at the town level?
So A Climate to Thrive has been a really important community partner at the town level to be able to try and take all of this data and information and then translate it into planning documents. And so they are working with all of the towns. I think finally Southwest is now contracted with them for those planning documents. And so having one source to help create all of these plans for each town will help build consistency across our communities and how we respond. But it really required a common set of understanding that was already available, but also helped and enhanced through this project and the other landscape of change projects. Amanda?
One quick question. I think you mentioned it earlier, but when did the drawbridge stop working? I understand that you didn't have the correct documents that said exactly how it was damaged, but the year again?
1851 was the year it was damaged and contracted to be repaired.
Okay.
I don't have the whole history of the bridge.
Right.
Bill probably does, but you can answer that separately. Yeah. All right, and Bill mentioned, and I will mention, you can also come and just check out the sea level rise project and leave a mark if you want to on the map, or take a sticker for the coastline projects. I did bring, part of this work is through our magazine called Chewbacca. So if you're a member, you receive this journal. This is the maritime edition, which is part of what prompted the sea level rise study that we've been working on. And Bill mentioned, we just found out today we won first place in a regional competition for publications for our work in Chewbacca. So. And Jen Steenboer's stained glass pictures were featured in that edition of Chewbacca that won. And so that's her connection, part of her connection with us. Thank you so much for coming tonight. If you have any additional questions or need anything else, I'm happy to answer them online. Thank you all so much for being here. And Catherine, thank you for answering questions and being online. That was a great help. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming, and remember, Southwest Harbor is a nonprofit, Southwest Harbor Public Library, as is the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. We both depend upon all of you to do all this wonderful work, to do the kinds of research they're doing, and for us to put on programs like this. So, thank you very much.